I have done a lot of things in my life that I am not proud of. I have lied to federal prosecutors. I have falsified documentation that sent an innocent man to prison for 14 months. I have run cons so clean and so precise that the people I ran them on thanked me afterward, genuinely, warmly, not knowing yet what I had taken. I have been, at various points in my adult life, a fraud investigator, a fraud perpetrator, a government asset, a government liability, and a man sitting alone in a parking lot at 2 in the morning, wondering which version of himself was the real one. I walked away from all of it 3 years ago. I got a house in Cincinnati, a legitimate consulting practice, a wife who made Sunday pot roast and complained about the neighbors and kissed me every morning before I'd brushed my teeth, which is either the truest form of love or a woman with no sense of smell. I thought I was done. I thought wrong. Welcome back to Dad's True Revenge. Grab your snacks, get comfortable, and remember, the people in these stories had every chance to behave themselves. They just chose wrong. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. You're going to love it here. My name is Bobby Anderson, and the day my life came back to collect what I owed it, it didn't arrive with sirens or federal agents or anything dramatic. It arrived as a phone call from a bank teller named Gary, who had an unfortunate habit of breathing through his mouth directly into the receiver. It was a Tuesday. Again, a Tuesday. I am starting to believe that Tuesdays have it out for me personally. I was at my desk, halfway through a compliance report for a regional credit union that paid adequately and required absolutely nothing interesting of me, which was exactly how I liked it. My coffee was hot. My dog, a beagle named Frank who had strong opinions about mail carriers, was asleep under my desk. The ceiling fan was doing its slow, reliable thing. My cell phone rang. Unknown number. Cincinnati area code. I answered with the particular suspicion I reserve for unknown numbers, which is to say I answered with complete cheerful neutrality that gives away nothing. This is Bobby Anderson. This is Gary calling from First Alliance Bank on Montgomery Road. I'm sorry to bother you, sir, but... Another pause, and what came in that pause was the specific hesitation of a man who has rehearsed a sentence and is now uncertain it's going to land the way he planned. I'm not sure quite how to say this. Try the beginning, I said. Works most of the time. Right, yes. Mr. Anderson, I don't think that's you. He said it like a confession. Your wife is here right now. With a man. And he looks, sir. He looks just like you. I put down my pen. Not dramatically. Just set it down. The way you set something down when your hands have decided they need to be empty for whatever comes next. I'm sorry, I said. The gentleman with your wife, Gary said carefully, presented your identification. Your driver's license, your account PIN, your social security number. Everything checks out on paper. But I've seen you come in here for 3 years, Mr. Anderson, and something is... He dropped his voice slightly. Something is off. The way he holds himself. Little things. I can't explain it exactly. 3 years. Gary had been watching me walk into that bank for 3 years and apparently cataloged enough of me to notice when the copy arrived. I made a mental note to tip Gary substantially better going forward. Are they still there? I said. My voice was even. Professionally, almost medically even. The kind of even that used to be my most valuable professional asset and that my therapist had told me 2 years ago was also my most significant personal liability. Yes, sir. They're at window 3. Your wife is doing most of the talking. What are they trying to do, Gary? A pause. Wire transfer, sir. Joint account. $240,000. Our entire liquid savings. 18 years of my wife's careful, disciplined, relentless saving. She kept a spreadsheet, color-coded, that she updated every single month, which I had always found both impressive and mildly terrifying. Gary, I said. Yes, sir. Find a reason to delay them. Tell them the system is slow. Tell them there's a verification hold. Tell them you need a supervisor. Tell them literally anything. Yes, I can do that. And Gary? Sir? Don't tell them you called me. I hung up. Frank the beagle opened one eye from under my desk, assessed my energy, and closed it again. Reasonable response. I sat for exactly 30 seconds, not because I needed to think. I knew what was happening before Gary finished his second sentence. I sat because 30 seconds was the amount of time I needed to put away the version of myself that had a pot roast wife and a ceiling fan and a color-coded savings spreadsheet, and locate the other one. The one I had spent 3 years burying under compliance reports and beagle walks, and the deliberate, effortful construction of an ordinary life. He was still there. He had been waiting with the patient confidence of someone who knew he'd be needed again eventually. I found him immediately. Of course I did. Let me tell you about Chris Cole. Chris and I met at 24. Both of us entry-level investigators at a private financial forensics firm in Chicago called Houston Group. He was lean, quick, with a face that was aggressively forgettable in the best possible way. The kind of face that slides through rooms without catching on anything. He could become someone else between the elevator and the lobby. I watched him do it once just to see, and by the time the doors opened, he had a different walk, different posture, and had somehow acquired what appeared to be a mild southern accent. I asked him afterward how he did it. Pick something to change, he said. Just one thing. Everything else follows. We were partners for 6 years. We ran investigations, built cases, dismantled fraud operations from the inside, with the specific satisfaction of people who understood the machinery, because they could have built it themselves. We were good. Better than good. We were the kind of team that made other investigators feel slightly bad about their own abilities, which we were not nearly humble enough about. The problem with being very good at understanding how cons work is that it is a philosophically short distance from understanding them to running them. Chris made that trip in year 5. I made it in year 6. I won't dress it up. We identified a target, a man running a legitimate Ponzi scheme, if such a thing can be said to exist, which is to say a man who was stealing money but stealing it from people who had themselves stolen it, and we took $200,000 out of his operation before reporting the rest to the SEC. We told ourselves it was justice adjacent. We told ourselves the math worked out morally. It didn't. The man we stole from, in the process of the SEC investigation, identified the discrepancy. Not us specifically, but the missing money. An investigator named Howard Finch was assigned to look into it. Howard Finch was thorough in the specific humorless way of people who become investigators because they genuinely believe in accuracy rather than outcomes. Chris panicked. I didn't panic, but I did something worse than panic. I helped Chris build a case, fabricated, precise, and devastatingly convincing, that pointed Howard Finch's investigation toward a junior analyst at Houston named Tilly Webb, who had nothing to do with any of it. Tilly Webb spent 14 months in federal prison. He was 27 years old. Chris and I walked away clean. I lasted 8 more months in that life before I couldn't anymore. I left Chicago. I left the industry. I moved to Cincinnati, built the practice, met my wife, a woman named Sandra, who was warm and steady and laughed at things I said, and asked about my day with what appeared to be genuine interest. I never told Sandra any of it. I told myself I was protecting her. I was protecting myself. Chris and I hadn't spoken in 3 years. The last thing he'd said to me, standing in the parking garage of the Houston building on the day I quit, was, "You can't just walk away from what we are, Bobby. It doesn't work like that." Sitting in my Cincinnati home office on a Tuesday morning with an empty phone call and a beagle under my desk, I was beginning to appreciate that Chris Cole had, as usual, been entirely correct. First Alliance Bank on Montgomery Road was 11 minutes from my house, under normal conditions. I made it in 7. I parked across the street rather than in the lot. Old habit. Positioning, always know your exit before you know your entrance. Through the bank's large front windows, I could see window 3 from where I sat. Sandra's honey blonde hair, her dark blue coat, the one she'd bought last November, the one with the oversized buttons she'd been so pleased about, and next to her, the back of a man's head. My height, my build, my haircut for that matter, though his was slightly neater than mine, which I found personally offensive. I sat in my car and I watched them for a moment. Sandra was talking to Gary, patient, warm, the way Sandra talked to everyone in service positions because she was the kind of person who actually meant it, when she asked how your day was going. The man next to her was looking at something on the counter, still, controlled. I recognized the stillness. I had taught Chris Cole to stand exactly that still in situations of elevated stress. Movement broadcasts, I used to tell him. Stillness says you have nothing to prove. He had been a very good student. My phone buzzed. Gary, texting from what I assumed was under the counter. "System delay only buys 10 more minutes, sir." I typed back. "That's enough." I got out of the car. I didn't go in the front entrance. There was a side door, commercial access, always unlocked during business hours, accessible to account holders with a card. I had used it exactly once before to drop off documents after hours. I used it now. The bank's interior from the side was a different geography than the front. I could see window 3 at an angle without being visible from it. I found the branch manager's office, knocked once, and opened the door before anyone answered. A woman in her 50s looked up from her desk with the expression of someone who had been about to say "come in," and was slightly annoyed at being preempted. Her nameplate said Patricia Holt, branch manager. "Miss Holt," I said, with the calm, pleasant authority of a man who belongs exactly where he is. "My name is Bobby Anderson. I have an account at this branch. There is a man at window 3 currently attempting to impersonate me and wire transfer my joint savings. I need 60 seconds of your time, and I need you to call the police while we talk. Can you do both those things simultaneously?" Patricia Holt looked at me. She looked at her computer. She typed something quickly, read whatever came up, and reached for her phone. "Sit down, Mr. Anderson," she said. I sat, and across the bank floor, through the glass partition, I watched the back of Chris Cole's head, still controlled, completely confident, standing next to my wife at window 3. My wife, who was supposed to be at her sick mother's house in Dayton. Her mother, who I happened to know, had been in excellent health since her hip replacement in March. I sat with that information in Patricia Holt's office, and I let it settle into its true shape. Slow, cold, and clarifying, the way things settle when you stop arguing with what they actually are. Sandra wasn't a victim in this room. Sandra had driven here. Sandra had brought him. If you've made it this far, do us one quick favor. Subscribe. A lot of people watch without ever doing it, but it costs you nothing and means everything to us. Thank you, genuinely. There's a particular kind of hurt that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive hot, the way anger does. It doesn't arrive with the sharp, immediate clarity of betrayal, the kind you feel in your chest like something physical, like something with edges. It arrives later, quieter. It arrives the way cold arrives in a room when a window has been open for hours and you've only just noticed. And you realize, standing there, that the room has been cold for a long time, and you simply kept convincing yourself it was fine. I sat in Patricia Holt's office, and I was, on the surface, completely fine. Calm, organized, functioning at the particular frequency I reserved for situations that required all available bandwidths and zero emotional interference. I had a job to do. I had maybe 8 minutes before Gary's system delay expired and Chris Cole attempted to walk out of that bank with my life savings, and my wife on his arm. I was completely fine. I noted clinically that my hands were absolutely steady. I noted this the way you note something you need to be true. Patricia Holt was, I will say, an exceptional human being in a crisis. She called the police with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had trained for exactly this scenario and was quietly pleased to finally use the training. She dispatched a silent alert to Gary through the bank's internal system. She pulled up my account on her screen, confirmed the wire transfer was still pending, still in the deliberately sluggish processing limbo that Gary had manufactured with admirable creativity. And she looked at me across her desk with the focused calm of a professional who needed exactly one more piece of information. "Mr. Anderson," she said, "the woman with this man, do you know her?" "Yes," I said. A pause. "Is she a joint account holder?" "That complicates the criminal exposure on the wire transfer," she said carefully. "If she's a joint holder authorizing the transaction—" "I understand," I said. "The impersonation element is still—" I said it gently, because none of this was her fault, and she was doing everything right. "I just need a few minutes with them before the police arrive. I need to understand the shape of this before it becomes official." She studied me. 2 minutes, she said. "The officers will be here in 5. 2 is enough." She stood, smoothed her jacket, and led me out of her office onto the bank floor. "I will tell you something about seeing a person impersonate you. It is one of the stranger experiences available to a human being. Stranger than I had anticipated, and I had spent considerable professional time thinking about impersonation from the technical side. But the technical side doesn't prepare you for the visceral, slightly surreal experience of walking up behind your own silhouette and tapping it on the shoulder. I didn't tap him on the shoulder. I came up beside him slowly, and I stood there for exactly 2 seconds before either of them noticed me. 2 seconds in which I was able to observe from a distance of about 18 inches just how good Chris Cole had gotten. The haircut was mine. The posture, that particular way I stand with my weight slightly left, a habit from an old ankle injury, was mine. He had my cadence when he spoke, the slight Chicago flatness that 3 years in Cincinnati hadn't fully smoothed out. He was wearing a jacket in almost exactly the shade of blue I wore most often. which meant Sandra had told him. Which meant Sandra had been paying attention for longer than I wanted to think about while standing in a bank. It was Chris who saw me first. He was mid-sentence, something to Gary about the transfer reference number, and then his peripheral vision caught me and he stopped, completely. One word into the sentence, no trailing off. Just stopped. Like a recording cut. He turned his head. We looked at each other, and Chris Cole smiled. Not a villain's smile. Not triumphant. Not cruel. It was the smile I remembered from 6 years of partnership. The slightly rueful, genuinely warm smile of a man who had missed you and was choosing an extraordinarily inconvenient moment to show it. Bobby, he said. Chris, I said. Sandra turned. Here is what Sandra's face did. And I am going to be precise because the sequence matters. First, shock. Genuine, unperformed. The kind that rearranges a face before the person wearing it can intervene. Then, something that was almost relief. So brief it was barely there. But I had spent 3 years learning the specific geography of Sandra's expressions, and I saw it. Then, fear. Not of me. Something more complicated than that. The fear of a person watching two separate worlds make contact for the first time. Bobby, she started. Don't, I said, not harshly. Just, not yet. I looked at Chris. Outside, I said. Both of you. Right now. Chris glanced at Gary. Gary, God bless him, was staring at a point roughly 6 inches above all of our heads, with the concentrated neutrality of a man who had decided that whatever was happening at window 3 was categorically above his pay grade. Chris straightened, adjusted his jacket. My jacket's color, my jacket's cut. The transfer, he began. Chris, I said his name the same way I used to say it when he was about to do something I'd already accounted for. The same tone. He heard it the same way he always had. He came out from behind the counter. We stood on the sidewalk outside First Alliance Bank in the November cold. The 3 of us, in the specific configuration of people who all know something that none of them have said yet. Sandra had her arms crossed, not defensively. I knew that posture. That was Sandra cold. Sandra trying to hold herself together through the physical act of self-containment. She was looking at the ground. Chris was looking at me with the expression of a man who has prepared for multiple versions of this conversation and is waiting to see which one we're having. I looked at him for a long moment. Tilly Webb, I said. Something moved through Chris's face, gone in an instant. But I saw it. The same thing I saw in my own mirror for months after I left Chicago. The specific expression of a name you've trained yourself not to flinch at, and still flinch at. Bobby. He got out 14 months ago, I said. I know his release date. I know where he is. I know he went back to school. Accounting, which is either ironic or logical depending on how you look at it. I know he has a daughter now. I know he lost his first 3 years of her life. I paused. I know that because I checked. Every 6 months. Because knowing doesn't fix it, but not knowing is worse. Chris was quiet. How long have you known about Sandra? I said. A pause. 2 years, he said. I absorbed that. 2 years. Sandra and I had been married for 3, which meant that somewhere in the first year of my deliberately ordinary Cincinnati life, the consulting practice, and the beagle and the color-coded spreadsheet, Chris Cole had found me, assessed me, and identified the precise mechanism that would hurt me most efficiently. And then he had waited a year before using it. That was the Chris I knew. Patient. Architectural. Never rushing to the destination when the journey could be made to serve the outcome. How? I said. Not accusatory. Genuinely curious, the way I had always been genuinely curious about good work even when the good work was being done to me. Chris almost smiled. You always order the same bourbon, he said. Same brand, same glass, neat. In Chicago, in Cincinnati, you walked into a bar 3 weeks after you moved, ordered your drink, and the bartender remembered you the next time because you tipped well and you were the only person ordering that specific label. He paused. It took me about a month from there. I thought about Sandra, about the bar where we met, a Tuesday evening which I was now realizing was a data point I should have examined more carefully, about how she had been sitting 2 seats down and had commented on my drink order with a specificity that I had found charming. Charming. She approached you, I said to Chris. Chris said nothing. I turned to Sandra. She was looking at me now, her arms still crossed, her face doing something I had no prior reference for. Because in 3 years of learning her expressions, I had never seen this one. And the reason I'd never seen it was that it was the one she'd been keeping from me. He contacted me first, she said, Her voice was steady, quiet. 2 years ago. Told me who you were. What you'd done. A breath. What you did to Tilly Webb. I stood with that. And? I said. And I didn't believe him. She looked at me directly. So I checked. How much did you find? Enough, she said. Simply. The word enough landed with the specific weight of a word that has been chosen carefully over a long period of time. Not everything. Not all of it. Enough. Which meant she had found what she needed to find, and had stopped looking before she found what she couldn't live with, which was its own kind of answer. Why didn't you leave? I said. She was quiet for a moment. Because I wanted to understand it first, she said. Who you were before. Whether the man I married was real or... She stopped. Chris said the money would go to Tilly, that it was restitution, that you'd stolen exactly $240,000 from the operation. He had the records, and that sending it back was the only way to. I said her name the way Ryan Hargrove said Rachel's name, and the way James Hargrove said his son's name. Quietly, precisely. Not with anger, but with the full weight of needing her to stop and hear me. The money was never going to Tilly Webb. She looked at Chris. Chris looked at the sidewalk, and there it was. The particular silence of a woman realizing she has been the most important instrument in someone else's plan, and was the last person in the room to know it. The account it was wiring to, I said to Chris. Where does it actually go? Nothing. Cayman? I said. Luxembourg. Chris, I built the same structures you did. I know the architecture. Panama, he said quietly. Sandra made a sound. The Tilly Webb story was the key, I said. Not to Chris, to Sandra. To her specifically, because she needed to hear this from me directly, in the cold outside a bank in Cincinnati, with 2 minutes left before the police arrived. He knew that was the thing that would get through to you. He knew because he's the one who helped me do it. He knows exactly what it costs me. He's been holding it for 3 years, Sandra, like a key, waiting for the right door. Sandra looked at Chris with an expression I recognized from my own mirror, the expression of a person understanding, for the first time, the full geometry of how they've been used. Chris looked up from the sidewalk. And here was the moment that surprised me. Because what was on his face was not the clean, composed expression of a man executing a plan. It was messier than that, more human than I'd expected from him, more than professional calculation. It was something old. I needed the money, Bobby, he said. And his voice for the first time had lost the performance. What was underneath was tired, cornered. A version of Chris Cole I had not seen since a parking garage in Chicago 3 years ago. Howard Finch. You remember Finch? Of course. He never stopped, Chris said. He retired from the federal side, but he never stopped. He's been building something privately for 2 years. He's close, Bobby. I needed to be gone before he got there. So you decided to take my savings and run. I decided to take what we both stole and use it to... It's not what we stole, Chris. I said it quietly. It's what Sandra saved. Dollar by dollar. For 18 years. Before she ever met me. You picked the wrong account. Chris had no answer for that. None of us did for a moment. Then from the corner of my eye, I saw 2 Cincinnati PD cruisers pulling into the bank parking lot, with the unhurried certainty of people who had been called rather than summoned. I looked at Chris. He looked at the cruisers. He looked back at me, and I saw him calculate the exit routes, the angles, the odds, with the same speed and precision I had watched him calculate 100 situations over 6 years. I watched him run every option. Then his shoulders dropped, a 1/4 inch, barely visible. There's a third account, he said quietly, fast, just for me. Not Panama. Domestic, Howard Finch's private research, everything he's built against both of us. It's all sourced through that account. I was going to use the money to access it, to get it before he filed. He held my eyes. It's not too late. You could still. Chris. Bobby. Stop. I said. He stopped. The officers were crossing the parking lot. I turned to Sandra. She was watching me with the expression of someone waiting for a verdict they've already half accepted. Something in her eyes that was past the shock and the anger and the manipulation. Something underneath all of that. Still there. Still looking at me. Waiting to see who I was going to be. I have some calls to make, I said to her. Tonight. There are things I should have told you a long time ago, and I'm going to tell you all of them. I held her gaze. Every single one. And then you're going to decide what you want to do. That's your decision. Not mine. She looked at me for a long moment. She nodded. Once, I turned to meet the officers. Chris Cole was detained at 2:17 p.m. on a Tuesday outside First Alliance Bank on Montgomery Road in Cincinnati, Ohio, for criminal impersonation and attempted wire fraud. He did not resist. He did not run. He walked toward the officers with the resigned, almost dignified composure of a man who had been running for 3 years and had finally, completely, run out of directions. As they walked him past me, he turned his head. "Finch is going to get there, Bobby," he said quietly, "with or without me. You've got maybe 60 days. I watched them put him in the car. Frank the Beagle, when I got home, was extremely pleased to see me in the uncomplicated way that only dogs and very young children are pleased to see people. Without condition, without history, without any of the weight that comes from knowing someone fully. I sat on the kitchen floor with him for a while. Then I got up, made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and started making calls. If you've been listening for a while and want stories like this to keep coming, it really helps if you hit that like button and subscribe. 97% of people never do, but it's what keeps this whole thing running. So, thank you for real. There is a moment in every con, every single one, without exception, where the architecture is visible. Not to the mark. Never to the mark. But to the person who built it, there is always a moment where you can see the whole structure at once. Every load-bearing wall, every false door, every carefully placed detail that makes the artificial look inevitable. You see it the way an architect sees a building they designed, not as a finished thing, but as a series of decisions, each one depending on the one before it. I had built enough of them to know what that moment felt like. Sitting at my kitchen table on a Tuesday night in Cincinnati, with cold coffee and a beagle asleep on my feet, and my wife in the next room doing the specific silence of a woman who is waiting with the patience of someone who has already waited 2 years and can manage a few more hours. I could see the whole structure. Not Chris's. Mine. The one I had been building for 3 years without knowing I was building it. The ordinary life. The compliance reports. The deliberately unremarkable practice. Every decision I had made since Chicago, laid out in sequence. And at the center of all of it, the load-bearing wall I had never examined, was Tilly Webb. I'm 27 years old, 14 months in federal prison. 3 years of his daughter's life he didn't get back, because of me. Not because of Chris, because of me. Chris had panicked. I had aimed the panic. I sat with that for a long time. Frank snored. The ceiling fan turned, and then I picked up my phone and made the first call. His name was still in my contacts. I had never deleted it, and I had never examined why I had never deleted it. Whether it was guilt keeping it there, or something else. Some part of me that knew this phone call was always going to happen eventually. It rang 4 times. Then, hello? A voice I recognized and didn't recognize simultaneously. Older, careful, with the specific wariness of a man who had learned that unknown callers rarely brought good news. "Tilly," I said. "This is Bobby Anderson." The silence that followed was the loudest silence I have ever personally produced. It lasted long enough that I checked the screen to confirm the call was still connected. Then he said, in a voice stripped of everything except the raw material underneath, "Why are you calling me? And because things are happening that involve you whether you want them to or not, and you deserve to know before they arrive at your door." I paused. "I'll understand if you hang up, but I'm asking you not to." Another silence. Shorter. "Talk," he said. I told him everything. Not the abbreviated version. Not the version with the softened edges and the context that makes the teller look slightly less like what they actually were. The whole thing, the operation, the money, the decision Chris and I made, the fabricated evidence, the specific way I had constructed the case against him, with the same professional precision I had used to construct legitimate cases for 6 years. I told him about leaving Chicago, about Cincinnati, about the consulting practice, and the deliberate ordinariness of the life I had built, partly because I wanted out, and partly because I did not entirely believe I deserved more than ordinary. I told him about today, about Chris, about Sandra, about Howard Finch and the 60 days Chris had mentioned outside the bank. When I finished, there was a silence that was different from the first one. Fuller, like a room after something loud has stopped. "Your daughter," I said. "How old is she now?" A pause. When he answered, his voice had changed in a way I couldn't fully name. 4, he said. "Her name is Joy." I closed my eyes briefly. "Tilly, I can't give you back what I took from you," I said. "I know that. I'm not calling to ask for forgiveness, and I'm not calling to make myself feel better about something that doesn't deserve to feel better. I opened my eyes. I'm calling because there's a way to make this right. Not completely, not in the way it should be right, but in the way that's still available. And it requires you to make a decision about whether you want to be part of it. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "What kind of decision?" Howard Finch arrived on a Thursday. I knew he was coming because I had called him first, Wednesday morning before my coffee was finished, before Sandra came downstairs, before I had fully talked myself into it, and while the part of me that hadn't fully talked myself into it could still be overruled by the part that knew it was the only move. Howard Finch was 61, retired from FBI financial crimes, with a voice like gravel being poured into a metal bucket, and the specific patient energy of a man who had spent 40 years being right about people and had learned to wait for them to confirm it. He had been building a private case against Chris and me for 2 years. Chris had been right about that. What Chris hadn't known, what I was counting on Chris not knowing, was that Howard Finch was not building the case to profit from it. He was building it because Tilly Webb had been his case. The wrongful conviction had lived in Finch's chest, like a splinter, for 3 years, working its way deeper every time he thought about it, and he had retired from the Bureau 6 months after Tilly's release, and started pulling the thread privately on his own time, with his own money, because some things a person cannot leave unfinished. He drove from Chicago to Cincinnati in a rented Ford, and sat across from me at my kitchen table with a legal pad and a cup of coffee he didn't touch, and he looked at me the way a man looks at something he has been trying to find for 2 years, and is now deciding what to do with. "You called me," he said. Not accusatory, just noting the fact. "I did," I said. "Why?" "Because Chris Cole told me you were 60 days out," I said. "And I decided I'd rather come to you than have you come to me." Finch looked at me steadily. "That's the strategic reason," he said. "What's the real one?" I looked at this man, who had spent 2 years and his own retirement money pursuing a wrong that most people had already filed away and forgotten, and I told him the truth. Because a 27-year-old kid lost 14 months of his life and 3 years of his daughter's because I pointed a finger at him, I said. And the least I can do is point the finger back at myself with the same precision. Finch steadied me for a long time. Then he opened his legal pad. "Start from the beginning," he said, "and don't leave anything out." I didn't leave anything out. Sandra sat in on the second hour. Not because I asked her to. She appeared in the kitchen doorway with fresh coffee, assessed the situation with the quiet competence that I had always admired and had never adequately told her I admired, and sat down at the table with the expression of a woman who has decided she is going to know all of it, and is prepared for what all of it costs. She heard things in that second hour that I had never told her. Things that were worse than what Chris had told her. Things that explained the person she'd married in ways that made the marriage, viewed from a certain angle, look like something built on a fault line. She didn't leave the table. She refilled Howard Finch's coffee once without being asked, and she stayed. That meant something. I couldn't tell you precisely what, but it meant something. Let me tell you about the third account. Chris, in the 2 seconds before the police put him in the car, had told me about Howard Finch's private research account. Everything Finch had built, 2 years of documentation, financial records, witness statements, sourced and accessible through a single domestic account that Chris had identified and planned to drain, destroying the evidence and the investigation simultaneously with the same transaction. Chris was smart. He was also, as it turned out, slightly less smart than he thought. Because the account he'd identified, the one he'd spent 6 months mapping, planning to access with the money from Sandra's savings, had a secondary holder, a name added 14 months ago. Quiet, unremarkable in the account structure, easy to miss if you were looking at the financials and not the administrative details. The secondary holder was Tilly Webb. Finch had found Tilly 2 years ago, had driven to Indianapolis, had sat across from a 29-year-old man rebuilding his life from the foundation up, and had told him the truth about what had happened to him and why. And Tilly had made a decision that I would not have made in his position. He had said yes. Yes to being part of building the case. Yes to helping gather what was needed. Yes to a 2-year process of quiet, patient, careful documentation that a man who wanted to run would have found unbearable. Tilly Webb had spent 14 months in federal prison for something he didn't do, and then he'd spent 2 years helping build the case that would prove it. When Finch told me this at my kitchen table, something happened to my face that I couldn't control. Sandra saw it and said nothing, which was the right thing to do. "He knows you called him," Finch said. I know, I said. He told me this morning, Finch said, that he wanted you to know something. He looked at his legal pad briefly, then back at me. He said, and I'm reading this directly because he asked me to. He said, tell him Joy's middle name is Carol, after his mother. The kitchen was very quiet. I looked at Finch. He named his daughter after my mother? My voice came out differently than I expected. Carol Webb, Finch said simply. 4 years old. I had to look away from both of them for a moment. At the window, at the yard, at nothing in particular. Frank, who had the instincts of a much more emotionally intelligent creature than his behavior around mail carriers, suggested padded over and sat on my foot. I reached down and put my hand on his head. What does he need from me? I said. A statement, Finch said, on record, fully corroborating the fabricated evidence, the methodology, your specific role. Combined with what I've built and what Tilly has provided, it closes the case completely. Criminal conviction overturned. Chris Cole faces federal charges that carry real weight, and you, he paused carefully, and me, I said. Finch looked at me evenly. Cooperation and voluntary disclosure carry significant weight in sentencing, he said. I can't make you any promises. The DA makes those decisions. I'm not asking for promises, I said. Bobby, Sandra said quietly. I know what this means, Sandra. I know you know, she said. I'm not trying to talk you out of it. She held my gaze across the table. I'm just saying your name so you know I'm here. I looked at my wife, this woman who had been approached by my former partner, handed the worst version of who I had been, and chose to stay at the table long enough to find out if there was more to the story. Who had been manipulated and used and had every reason to be walking out the door and was instead sitting in our kitchen at 10 in the morning, offering Howard Finch a second cup of coffee. I know, I said. I turned back to Finch. Where do I sign? I said. Here is what happened. In the clean, factual sequence that lives at the other end of all of it. Chris Cole was charged with criminal impersonation, attempted wire fraud, and once my statement was added to Finch's case, conspiracy in the original securities fraud and wrongful conviction of Tilly Webb. He pled guilty to reduced charges 11 months later and received 6 years. He will be 51 when he gets out. I received 18 months of supervised release, a substantial financial penalty, and a permanent bar from the financial industry. My attorney said it was the best outcome the cooperation agreement could have produced. She said it with the careful neutrality of a woman who did not want to editorialize. The consulting practice closed. Obviously. Tilly Webb's conviction was formally overturned 7 months after my statement. There was a brief news cycle about it, the kind that arrives fast and leaves faster, because the world moves quickly, and wrongful conviction stories are, devastatingly, not uncommon enough to hold attention for long. Tilly gave one interview to a reporter in Indianapolis in which he said he had no comment about the people responsible and was focused on his daughter. His daughter. Joy Carol Webb. 4 years old, named after a woman she would never meet, carrying a name given by a man whose capacity for grace so far exceeded his circumstances that I had no adequate framework for it. I have not contacted Tilly again. That was his boundary, communicated through Finch, and I will hold it for as long as he holds it and indefinitely after that if that's what he needs. Some debts are not repaid by the debtor. They are carried. You carry them not because carrying them changes anything for the person you wronged, but because putting them down would require a kind of forgetting that you have no right to. I carry it. Sandra and I sold the house in November. We moved to a smaller place in Kentucky, across the river, the kind of town where nobody knows your name yet but the hardware store owner will learn it inside a month, because that's what hardware store owners do. I got a job teaching financial literacy at a community college, which pays a third of what the consulting practice paid and requires me to be coherent at 8 in the morning. Which is genuinely the hardest part. Sandra got a position at a local nonprofit. She comes home with paperwork and genuine complaints about her coworkers, and occasionally with the leftover food from their fundraising events, which are always aggressively wholesome, and which Frank the Beagle has strong opinions about. We are, by most external measurements, unremarkable. We are, by every measurement that actually matters, more honest with each other than we have ever been. Because there is nothing left to protect. I told her everything, every version of myself, every choice, every calculation. I handed it all over and she held it and made her decision. She stayed. Not because the past was acceptable. It wasn't. Not because I deserved it. I didn't. She stayed because she decided, with full information and clear eyes, and the sovereign authority of a woman who knows exactly who she is, that the man at my kitchen table making calls at midnight was someone she wanted to know. That distinction matters to me more than I can say. I think about Chris Cole sometimes. Not with anger. With something more complicated. The sad, clear-eyed recognition that we were the same person for 6 years, and then made different choices at the same fork, and that the choices compounded over time until we were standing on opposite sides of a thing that could not be crossed. He was brilliant. He was at his best the best partner I ever had. And he used every gift he had in service of a fear he never once faced, directly. I understand the fear. I had the same one. The difference, I think, was Sandra sitting at a kitchen table, was Howard Finch driving from Chicago on his own time, was Tilly Webb naming his daughter after my mother, which is an act of humanity so enormous I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of it, without ever fully getting there. The difference was having people who made the right thing feel possible instead of just correct. Frank died the following spring. I mention this not for drama, but because he deserves to be in the record. 13 years old, went quietly in his sleep on the kitchen floor, surrounded by the same linoleum and the same ceiling fan, and the same general air of having lived exactly the life he was built for. We got another beagle 3 months later. Sandra named her Tuesday. I told Sandra that Tuesdays had a complicated history for me. Sandra said that was exactly why. I looked at this woman, at the specific, particular, irreplaceable architecture of her, and I thought about all the versions of this story that could have been written. The version where I never answered Gary's call. The version where I ran when the police arrived. The version where I took Chris's 60-day warning and used it the way the old Bobby Anderson would have used it. To disappear. And then I looked at Tuesday the Beagle, who had the same strong opinions about mail carriers as her predecessor, and was already in the process of establishing herself as the dominant personality in our household. And I thought about Joy Carol Webb in Indianapolis. And I thought about Howard Finch driving home to Chicago with a closed legal pad and a case that was finally finished. And I thought about my mother, Carol Anderson, a woman I have not mentioned until this moment because she belongs at the end of this story rather than the beginning, who raised me alone in a small apartment in Chicago and who told me exactly once, when I was 9 years old and had lied about something I no longer remember, something I have never forgotten. She said, "Bobby, the truth doesn't need you to protect it. It just needs you to stop hiding from it." I spent 30 years hiding from it. I spent one Tuesday finding my way back. My name is Bobby Anderson. I am a former fraud investigator, a former fraud perpetrator, a community college instructor, and a man who answers the phone when unknown numbers call, because I have learned at considerable personal expense that the calls you don't want to take are usually the ones you need. I have been the mark. I have been the architect. I have been, on my best day, the man who picked up the phone and told the truth to everyone who needed to hear it. That last one is the one I'm working on being again, every single day. That's the whole story. Except for Tuesday the Beagle, who is currently eating something she shouldn't be. And that story never ends. If you like this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw, and family-centered stories. And as always, thank you for being a part of this sphere.